Daniel stood in the bright hospital hallway, his white doctor's coat wrinkled and stained with coffee from the morning shift. He was 34 years old, and if you asked anyone at the hospital, they would tell you he was one of the best heart surgeons they had. But success always comes with a price, doesn't it? For Daniel, that price was his marriage. 2 years ago, his wife Rebecca had signed the divorce papers. There were no big fights, no dramatic scenes. Their relationship had just quietly died under the weight of his crazy work schedule. The emergency room was busy that evening, like it always was. Nurses rushed past him, ambulance sirens wailed outside, and somewhere a phone kept ringing. Daniel was tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones after working 3 days straight. He was thinking about going home, maybe ordering some food, and crashing on his couch when he heard it. A laugh, not just any laugh, but one he would recognize anywhere, even in his sleep. He stopped walking. His heart started beating faster. It couldn't be her. What were the chances? But when he pulled back the curtain of the third examination room, there she was. Rebecca sat on the hospital bed, holding her left wrist carefully, her dark hair cut shorter than he remembered. When their eyes met, the world seemed to stop for a second. She looked surprised to see him, her mouth opening slightly before she managed a small smile. Daniel felt like someone had punched him in the chest. 2 years. It had been 2 whole years since he had seen her face, and now here she was, sitting in his emergency room like fate had decided to play a cruel joke on both of them. He cleared his throat and tried to sound professional. What happened? She explained that she had been hiking in the hills outside the city and had slipped on some loose rocks. Her wrist hurt badly, and her friend had insisted on bringing her to the hospital. Daniel nodded and gently took her hand to examine it. The moment his fingers touched her skin, he felt that old familiar electricity. He wondered if she felt it to dot as he checked her wrist, moving it carefully to see where it hurt. They made small talk, the kind of safe conversation two strangers might have, even though they had once shared everything. Rebecca told him she was working as a professional photographer now, traveling around capturing beautiful moments for magazines and websites. Daniel told her about his promotion to head of the cardiac department. Neither of them mentioned the divorce. Neither of them talked about the fights they'd had about him never being home, or how she had cried herself to sleep so many nights, or how he had buried himself in work to avoid facing what they were losing. The x-ray showed a minor fracture, nothing too serious, but she would need to wear a brace for a few weeks. As Daniel wrapped her wrist in a support bandage, his hands moved with practiced skill, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was remembering Sunday mornings when they used to sleep in late, the smell of her perfume on his pillow, the way she used to steal his French fries even when she ordered her own. When he finished, he stepped back and gave her instructions about keeping the wrists elevated and taking pain medication if she needed it. Rebecca nodded, but she wasn't really looking at the bandage. She was looking at him, really looking at him, the way she used to before everything fell apart. Then she did something that surprised both of them. She reached out with her good hand and caught his before he could move away. Her touch was soft, hesitant, like she was afraid he might pull back. Daniel stood there, frozen, feeling the warmth of her palm against his. Rebecca bit her lip, that nervous habit she had never gotten rid of. And then the words just tumbled out of her mouth. She told him she was only in town for tonight. She had a hotel room downtown. Would he maybe want to grab coffee? Just to talk properly? Just to catch up like old friends? Every logical part of Daniel's brain was screaming at him to say no. They had gotten divorced for good reasons. Going backward never worked. People always said you can't fix what's broken by gluing the same pieces back together. But his heart, that stupid, hopeful thing in his chest, had already made a different decision. Before he could stop himself, he heard his own voice saying yes. He watched Rebecca's face light up with a smile, a real genuine smile, and for the first time in 2 years, Daniel felt something other than emptiness. They exchanged phone numbers again, like teenagers on a first date. Rebecca promised to text him the name of the coffee shop, and Daniel promised to be there at 7. As she walked out of the emergency room with her friend, she looked back once. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Daniel felt his stomach flip. What was he doing? This was probably the worst idea he'd had in years. But he couldn't help it. Some part of him, the part that had never stopped loving her, needed to see where this would go. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. Daniel went through the motions of checking patients and signing charts. But his mind was miles away. He kept looking at his watch, counting down the hours until 7. When his shift finally ended, he rushed home to shower and change. Standing in front of his closet, he realized he was nervous. Actually nervous. His hands were shaking as he buttoned his shirt. This was ridiculous. He had performed heart surgeries on dying patients without breaking a sweat. But the thought of having coffee with his ex-wife had him falling apart at 6:45. Daniel stood outside the small coffee shop Rebecca had chosen. It was a quiet place on a side street, somewhere neither of them had been together before. Neutral ground. He went inside and ordered a black coffee, then sat at a table by the window where he could watch the door. His coffee went cold as he waited, too anxious to drink it, when Rebecca walked in at 7 exactly. The evening sun was coming through the windows behind her, and for just a moment, Daniel forgot how to breathe. She had changed into a simple dress, and her hair was down round her shoulders. She looked beautiful. She had always been beautiful, but somehow he had forgotten just how much. She spotted him and walked over, and when she sat down across from him, Daniel realized that agreeing to this coffee might have been the best and worst decision of his life. They started talking carefully, like two people who had just met and were trying to figure each other out. Rebecca ordered a cappuccino and wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Even though it was a warm evening outside, Daniel noticed she still did that. Held her coffee with both hands like she was trying to steal its warmth. Some things never changed. She started telling him about her photography work, and as she talked, her whole face came alive. She showed him pictures on her phone. There were stunning landscapes of mountains at sunrise, oceans that looked like glass, forests where the light came through the trees in golden rays. Then she showed him portraits, close-up shots of people's faces that somehow captured everything they were feeling, without them saying a word. Daniel found himself genuinely amazed. This was the dream she had always talked about but never quite had the courage to chase. When they were married, he told her he was proud of her, and the words came out before he could think about whether he had the right to say them anymore. Rebecca looked up at him with those warm brown eyes and smiled softly. That simple moment felt important somehow, like they were acknowledging that even though they weren't together anymore, they could still care about each other's happiness. Daniel talked about the hospital, about the surgeries he performed and the lives he managed to save. But he also told her about the harder parts, about the patients he couldn't save no matter how hard he tried, and how those losses stayed with him. He told her about his apartment, which still felt too empty and too quiet even after 2 years. He talked about his sister's kids, who called him Uncle Daniel and asked him why he didn't have a family of his own. When he said that, his voice cracked a little, and Rebecca reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Without either of them deciding it should happen, coffee turned into dinner. They left the coffee shop and walked 2 blocks to a small Italian restaurant, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths, candles on every table, and the smell of garlic and fresh bread filling the air. They ordered pasta and wine, and as the wine slowly disappeared from their glasses, their carefully guarded words started to loosen up. The conversation got deeper, more honest. They started talking about the marriage, about where everything went wrong. Daniel admitted things he had never said out loud before. He told Rebecca that he had been so obsessed with becoming the best surgeon, with proving himself, that he had forgotten to be a good husband. He had missed anniversaries and birthdays. He had canceled dates at the last minute. He had come home too tired to talk, too stressed to listen, too focused on his next surgery to notice that his wife was lonely and hurting. Rebecca listened quietly, and then she shared her own truth. She admitted that she had been scared to ask for what she needed. Instead of telling him directly that she felt ignored and unimportant, she had built up resentment silently. She had kept score of every missed dinner, every forgotten promise, every time he chose the hospital over her. By the time she finally spoke up, She wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding, angry, bitter. And by then, it was too late to fix anything. They both sat with that honesty for a moment, letting it settle between them like something fragile and precious. It was strange, Daniel thought, how they were finally having the conversations they should have had 3 years ago. Better late than never, his grandmother used to say. But was it too late for them? The restaurant started to empty around them. The waiter had already brought their check twice, politely hinting that they were the last customers. But neither Daniel nor Rebecca wanted to move. This bubble they had created felt safe, and stepping outside of it meant facing reality again. Finally, Rebecca reached across the table and took Daniel's hand properly. Not just a quick squeeze, but really holding it. Her thumb traced small circles on his palm, a gesture so familiar it made his chest hurt with memories. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was sadness there, definitely, but also something else. Something that looked like longing, or maybe hope, or maybe both mixed together. Then she said the words that Daniel knew would change everything. Her voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper, but he heard every word clearly. She told him she wanted one more night. Just one more night. She said they had ended things so quickly, signed papers and divided furniture, and said goodbye before either of them was ready. She wanted one more night to remember what they used to be, to say a proper goodbye, or maybe. And she didn't say this part out loud, but Daniel heard it anyway in the way she was looking at him. Maybe to see if there was anything left worth holding onto. Daniel's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. This was dangerous territory. One more night could break them both all over again. But looking into her eyes, feeling her hand in his, remembering everything they used to be, he found himself nodding. Yes, one more night. They could do that. They deserved that much, didn't they? They paid the check and walked out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet now. Just a few cars passing by and the distant sound of music from somewhere. Rebecca shivered slightly, and without thinking, Daniel took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She pulled it tight around herself and smiled up at him. That smile nearly killed him. His apartment was only 10 minutes away by car. They drove in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that sits between two people who understand each other, who don't need to fill every moment with words. Daniel's mind was racing, though. What were they doing? Was this a terrible mistake? But every time he glanced over at Rebecca in the passenger seat, with his jacket wrapped around her and the city lights reflecting in her eyes, those doubts seemed smaller and less important. When they pulled up to his building, Daniel suddenly felt nervous all over again. His hands were shaking as he turned off the car. Rebecca looked at the building, then at him, and for a second he thought she might change her mind. But instead, she opened her door and stepped out into the night. Daniel followed, and together they walked into his building, into the elevator, down the hall to his door. Each step felt important, like they were walking towards something that would change both their lives, for better or worse. Daniel unlocked his apartment door and let Rebecca walk in first. He watched her move slowly through the space, taking everything in with careful attention. The place looked completely different from when she had lived there. He had bought new furniture after the divorce, simple modern pieces that matched nothing. The walls were bare where her paintings used to hang, just empty white space that he had never bothered to fill. The kitchen actually looked clean and organized now, evidence that he had finally learned to cook for himself instead of living on a hospital cafeteria. Food and takeout. Rebecca ran her fingers along the back of the new couch, studying the empty walls, the neat bookshelf, the small kitchen table with only 2 chairs. Daniel could see her taking it all in, understanding what she was seeing. This was the home of a man who had learned to live alone, someone who had built a life around his own routines and quiet evenings. Something about that seemed to make her sad, and honestly, it made Daniel sad too when he saw it through her eyes. The awkwardness hit them both at the same moment. Here they were, 2 people who had once known each other's bodies better than their own, who had shared a bed for years, and now they were standing in this living room like strangers on a first date. Daniel's hands felt clumsy and useless. He shoved them in his pockets, then took them out again. Rebecca tucked her hair behind her ear 3 times in a row, a nervous gesture he remembered well. Daniel broke the tension by offering wine. His hand shook slightly as he poured 2 glasses of red wine in the kitchen. When he came back to the living room, Rebecca had already made herself comfortable on the couch. She had kicked off her shoes and curled her legs under her. Sitting in that relaxed way she always used to, she patted the cushion next to her, and Daniel sat down, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. But Rebecca wasn't having any of that distance. As soon as he sat down, she shifted closer and tucked herself against his side. Her head found that perfect spot on his shoulder, the one that seemed made just for her. Daniel's arm automatically went round her, and just like that, the awkwardness melted away. This, at least, they still knew how to do. They started talking, really talking, in a way they hadn't managed to do in the final year of their marriage. Rebecca told him about the loneliness of starting over. She had moved to Seattle for a fresh start, thinking a new city would help her move on. She had made some friends, built up her photography business, created a life that looked good on paper. But something was missing. She had gone on dates, met nice guys who checked all the right boxes, but none of them felt right. None of them measured up to the ghost of what she and Daniel used to have. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he listened. He knew exactly what she meant because he had lived the same experience. He confessed that after the divorce, he had thrown himself even deeper into work, taking every extra shift he could get. But about 6 months ago, something had changed. He had watched a colleague, an older doctor, have a heart attack right there in the hospital cafeteria. The man survived, thankfully, but it had shaken Daniel badly. He realized he was heading down the same path, working himself into an early grave with nothing, and no one to show for it. So he had made changes, real changes. He cut his hours back, learned to delegate, actually started taking his vacation days. He went to therapy and worked through why he had used work as an escape from everything else in his life. He learned to cook, joined a gym, even started playing guitar again, something he hadn't done since college. He had built a life that had room in it for something besides the hospital. But there was no one to share that life with. He had gone on a few dates too, met women through friends or dating apps, but his heart was never in it, because if he was being honest, really honest, he had never stopped comparing everyone to Rebecca. The wine made them brave enough to dive into memories, happy memories this time, not the painful ones. Their wedding day came up first. It had rained, a complete downpour that ruined all their outdoor plans. But instead of being upset, Rebecca had laughed. She had kicked off her fancy shoes and danced in the rain in her wedding dress while Daniel watched, completely in love with this woman who found joy even when things went wrong. They talked about their honeymoon in Greece. They had rented a tiny apartment on one of the islands and spent 2 weeks exploring. One day they had gotten completely lost trying to find a beach someone had recommended. They had walked for hours in the hot sun, arguing about which direction to go, until they finally admitted they had no idea where they were. They had ended up at a small taverna where an old Greek woman had fed them and given them directions. And somehow that lost afternoon had become one of their favorite memories. The small moments came flooding back too. Daniel used to bring Rebecca coffee in bed every Sunday morning, exactly how she liked it, with too much cream and to sugars. Rebecca used to leave little notes in his coat pockets, small messages that he would find during his shifts at the hospital. They used to dance in the kitchen late at night to songs only they could hear. Moving together in the quiet darkness of their home. As they talked, Rebecca shifted position. She turned to face Daniel, fully, tucking one leg under her and looking at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Her eyes were bright, searching his face like she was looking for something she desperately needed to find. She reached up and cupped his cheek, her thumb brushing along his jaw the way it used to. Her touch was gentle but electric. She asked him a question, her voice barely more than a whisper. Did he still feel it? That pull between them? That connection? That spark that had brought them together all those years ago at a coffee shop? When they were both in college? Did any of that still exist? Or had time and hurt killed it completely? Daniel didn't answer with words. He couldn't. Instead, he leaned forward and kissed her. The moment their lips met, it felt like falling and flying at the same time. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like they were both afraid of pushing too hard. But then Rebecca made a small sound in the back of her throat, and something broke loose in both of them. The kiss deepened, became urgent. 2 years of longing and regret and hope poured into it. Rebecca's fingers tangled in Daniel's hair, pulling him closer. His hands found her waist, spanning the curve of it, remembering exactly how she fit against him. For those perfect moments, nothing existed outside of the two of them and the electric current running between their bodies. They broke apart just long enough to breathe. Their foreheads pressed together, both of them shaking slightly. Rebecca's eyes were dark and intense. Without saying anything, she stood up and held out her hand to Daniel. He took it, letting her pull him to his feet. They walked down the hallway to his bedroom, their fingers intertwined, neither of them speaking because words felt too small for what was happening. Morning light crept through the curtains that Daniel had forgotten to close the night before. The sun painted the bedroom in soft gold, making everything look gentle and warm. Rebecca woke up first. She was still pressed against Daniel's chest, their bodies tangled together under the sheets. For a few perfect seconds, she let herself pretend that nothing had changed, that this was just another normal morning in a life they still shared together. But reality has a way of pushing through even the nicest dreams. Her phone on the nightstand showed the time, 8 in the morning. Her flight back to Seattle was at 2 in the afternoon. In 6 hours, she would be on a plane, heading back to her real life. Her studio, her clients, her little apartment with the view of the water. Her friends who knew nothing about this night. All of that was waiting for her, solid and real and impossible to ignore. Daniel stirred beside her. His arms tightened around her instinctively before his eyes opened. Like even in sleep his body wanted to hold onto her. When he finally woke up and looked at her, Rebecca saw the same realization dawn on his face. The night was over. They had gotten there one more night, and now they had to figure out what came next. Neither of them wanted to be the first to speak. They lay there for a while longer, just holding each other. Both of them acutely aware that every minute that passed was 1 minute closer to goodbye. Finally, Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead and suggested breakfast. They got up slowly, neither of them quite ready to face the day, but knowing they had to. Making breakfast together felt strange and familiar at the same time. Daniel scrambled eggs at the stove while Rebecca made toast and poured coffee. They moved around the kitchen with an ease that came from muscle memory. Daniel knew without asking that Rebecca took her coffee with cream and to sugars. Rebecca knew without checking that Daniel liked his eggs with black pepper and hot sauce. If someone had walked in right then, they would have seen a couple that looked comfortable together. Natural, like they did this every morning. But underneath that surface comfort, tension crackled with everything they weren't saying. They sat down at the small kitchen table with their plates. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. The food tasted like dust in Rebecca's mouth, but she forced herself to eat anyway because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Daniel pushed his eggs around his plate, barely eating anything. Finally, Rebecca couldn't take it anymore. She set down her fork and asked the question that had been sitting heavy between them all morning. What were they doing? What was this? Last night had been beautiful and perfect and everything she had hoped for. But now what? Were they supposed to just pretend it never happened and go back to their separate lives? Daniel put down his coffee cup very carefully, like he was afraid it might break. When he looked up at her, his eyes were full of so much emotion that Rebecca felt her chest tighten. He told her the truth, simple and direct. He loved her, still loved her, had never stopped loving her, probably would never stop loving her for the rest of his life. Last night had reminded him of everything good they used to have, everything he had lost when he let his work consume him. And Rebecca heard the heartbreak in that single word. Love alone hadn't been enough before. They had loved each other during the marriage too, but that love hadn't stopped them from hurting each other. It hadn't stopped the fights or the resentment or the slow death of their relationship. They had tried once, put everything they had into their marriage, and they had failed. How could they be sure it would be any different this time? Rebecca felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She told Daniel he was right, and admitting it hurt worse than anything. She confessed that coming to his apartment last night had been selfish. She had told herself it was about closure, about saying goodbye properly. But really, deep down, she had been hoping for something impossible. She had been hoping that one night could somehow fix everything, that they could erase 2 years and all the pain and start over with a clean slate, like none of the bad stuff had ever happened. But life didn't work that way. You couldn't just rewind time and make different choices. She had built a whole new life in Seattle. Her photography business was finally taking off. She had steady clients and upcoming projects. She had friends who cared about her. She couldn't just throw all of that away on the hope that maybe things would be different this time. And Daniel, she continued, was still the same man in many ways. Yes, he said he had made changes. Yes, he was working fewer hours now, but he was still a surgeon, still married to his work in ways he probably didn't even realize. The hospital would always need him. There would always be emergencies, always be patients whose lives depended on him. Could he really promise that this time would be different? Could he honestly say he wouldn't fall back into old patterns? The conversation grew heated. Old wounds that had never properly healed started opening back up. Rebecca's voice rose as she reminded him of all the times he had promised to come home for dinner and never showed up, all the anniversaries he had forgotten, all the nights she had cried herself to sleep in an empty bed. Daniel fired back, his own voice tight with frustration. He pointed out that she had never really believed in them, not deep down. She had always had one foot out the door, always been waiting for him to fail. Always been looking for proof that he would let her down. The words were designed to hurt. Defense mechanisms against the pain of losing each other all over again. They were both breathing hard, both wounded, both scared. This was exactly how fights used to go during the marriage. Both of them saying things they didn't mean just to avoid feeling vulnerable. Then Rebecca broke. The tears she had been holding back finally came, and she couldn't stop them. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, her whole body shaking. She whispered that she didn't want to say goodbye again. One more night hadn't been enough. It could never be enough. She wanted more nights and more mornings and everything they used to have. But how could they make it work? Nothing had really changed. They still lived in different cities. They still had the same problems. What were they supposed to do? Daniel was round the table in a second, pulling her into his arms. He held her tight against his chest while she cried, his own tears falling silently into her hair. He didn't have an answer for her. He wanted to tell her they could figure it out, that love would be enough this time, that they could make it work. But the words stuck in his throat because he wasn't sure they were true. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other and crying, both of them feeling completely lost. Rebecca's suitcase sat by the front door, packed and zipped and ready to go. The taxi company had confirmed her pickup. 30 minutes and a car would arrive to take her to the airport. She stood in the middle of Daniel's living room, trying to memorize every detail. The way afternoon light came through the windows. The faint smell of his cologne that seemed to linger in the air. The exact shade of blue in his eyes when he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world. That mattered. Daniel spoke first, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was rough, like the words hurt coming out. He told her he couldn't do this again. He couldn't watch her walk away. Couldn't survive another 2 years of wondering what if and torturing himself with memories. If she got in that taxi, if she went back to Seattle, he needed it to be final. No phone calls checking in on each other. No text messages on birthdays or holidays. No accidental meetings if she visited town again. A complete clean break, for both their sakes, because anything else would destroy them both. Rebecca's heart shattered at the ultimatum, but she understood it. She really did. Staying in touch would only drag out the pain, keep the wound from healing properly. She nodded, accepting the terms even though they felt impossible. She picked up her suitcase, feeling its weight in her hand like it represented everything she was about to lose again. Daniel moved toward the door to open it for her. His hand was already on the doorknob. His face was a mask of control, but she could see the devastation underneath it. Could see how much this was costing him? This was it. This was really goodbye. But then he stopped. His hand froze on the doorknob. He stood there for a long moment, completely still, like he was having some kind of internal war with himself. Then he turned back around, and the look on his face was wild and desperate and completely open in a way. She had rarely seen him. He asked her to wait. Just wait one more minute, please. Then he did something Rebecca never in a million years expected. Daniel dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the living room. Not like he was proposing, but like his legs just couldn't hold him up anymore under the weight of what he needed to say. And then he laid his entire heart bare in front of her. Daniel told her he had spent 2 years lying to himself, convincing himself that he was fine, that being alone was fine, that throwing himself into work was enough. But last night had destroyed every single one of those lies. He wasn't fine. Work wasn't enough. Nothing was enough without her. He needed her, not the memory of her or the idea of her, but her, Rebecca, exactly as she was, with all her demands and complications and the way she made him want to be a better person than he had ever been on his own. He told her he had an offer from the hospital, something he had been sitting on for months without a good reason to accept it. They wanted him to move to part-time consulting. He would still do surgeries, but only the most critical ones. He would supervise and train younger surgeons instead of working himself to exhaustion. The pay would be less, but it would also give him his life back. He had been too scared to take the offer before because what was the point of having free time when there was no one to spend it with? But now he had a reason. He could take that consulting position. He could cut his hours. He could even split his time between cities if she wanted. Rebecca had always talked about wanting to travel more for her photography work, visiting different places, capturing stories from all over the country. What if he came with her? What if they built a life that wasn't tied to one place, a life that had room for both their dreams? He told her it wouldn't be perfect. There would still be struggles and compromises. There would be hard conversations they would have to keep having, again and again, probably for the rest of their lives. But he wanted to try. If she was willing to trust him one more time, just one more time, he would prove that he had actually changed. He would show her every single day that he was ready to choose her the way he should have chosen her. From the very beginning, Rebecca stood frozen with her suitcase still in her hand. Her brain was screaming at her that this was crazy. People didn't change, not really. They would just end up hurting each other all over again. This was exactly the kind of foolish hope that led to disaster. But her heart, that stubborn thing in her chest, was already screaming yes. Her suitcase slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a thud. She told Daniel she was terrified. Trying again meant risking everything all over again. It meant putting her heart on the line, knowing exactly how much it could hurt when things fell apart. It meant being vulnerable in a way that scared her more than anything. But she was all so tired. Tired of pretending she was over him. Tired of comparing every man she met to the one she had never stopped loving. Tired of living half a life because she was too scared to reach for what she really wanted. Daniel stood up from the floor and crossed to her in 3 quick steps. He took her face in both his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. He promised her that this time would be different. Not perfect, he said again, because nothing ever was. But real, honest, worth every risk they were taking. Rebecca pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the taxi company. She canceled her ride. Then she called her assistant back in Seattle and asked her to reschedule the next week of appointments. She would explain later, she said, but something important had come up. Daniel was already on his own phone, calling the hospital. He told them he was taking personal time starting immediately. 2 weeks, maybe more. He would let them know. They spent that week doing what they should have done years ago. They went to couples counseling, finding a therapist who could see them the very next day. They had long, difficult conversations about boundaries and needs and expectations. They made lists of things that were non-negotiable and things they could compromise on. They argued, but this time they argued productively, learning how to fight fair instead of fighting to win. They also laughed together. They went on dates like they were getting to know each other again. They held hands walking through the park. They cooked dinner together and danced in the kitchen to actual music this time. They made plans, real concrete plans about how to build a life together that honored both their needs. 6 months later, Daniel accepted the consulting position. Rebecca opened a second photography studio, this time in Portland, right between Seattle and Daniel's city. They got an apartment together in Portland, neutral territory that belonged to both of them and neither of them. It was a fresh start in a place with no old memories to haunt them. It wasn't easy. There were fights and doubts. There were moments when old patterns tried to creep back in. When Daniel worked too late or Rebecca shut down instead of communicating. But they kept showing up for each other. They kept doing the hard work. They kept choosing each other even when it would have been easier to walk away. 1 year after that night, Daniel proposed. This time with a ring and a whole speech he had practiced about second chances and the courage it takes to believe in them. Rebecca said yes through happy tears. They got married in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. This time when they spoke their vows, they really meant them. This time they were making promises they had finally grown enough to keep. At their wedding reception, they danced close while their friends and family watched and smiled. Rebecca whispered in Daniel's ear, thanking him for that one more night. Daniel pulled her even closer and whispered back, thanking her for staying, for believing, for being brave enough to try again. Because that was the thing about love that they had finally learned. Sometimes it wasn't about the first chance or even the second chance. Sometimes it was about finding the courage to reach for one more night, and then deciding to reach for another one, and then another one after that. Building a whole lifetime out of those moments of brave, foolish, beautiful hope.